series for RhoMobile Suite. Today is a topic that has to do with building applications for iOS. So I am your moderator as well as your presenter for today. So I will be covering this topic on how to use RhoMobile Suite and build applications for iOS. Okay, we'll first start off with just a quick update on where we're going with the webinar series, and then we'll end the call with a nice resource of the week. As always, just some housekeeping for those see some new faces on the list here. Please ask the questions via GoToMeeting, and I'll queue those up at the end. And then also, if you can just leave me some feedback when you exit the presentation, let me know some topics that you'd like to see covered in the upcoming weeks, and let me know how this topic was and what you thought of it. That would be great. Okay, so our next topic, we're actually going to have a week off next week. I will be on vacation. We have a holiday here in the U.S., so we're going to skip next week's webinar, and it'll be the following week on November 28th. And we have an upcoming RhoMobile Suite 2.2 release coming up. So Adam Blum will be presenting and going over, giving some demos of some new features in the upcoming 2.2. So there's a link to register if you want to register for that now. Of course, we'll send out some reminders in the next week or so. But if you want to attend that session, sign up. We'll be covering the upcoming release of RhoMobile Suite. Last week, I had presented not a new tool, a pretty cool tool on text editor, Sublime Text 2, and how you can use that with RhoStudio to really improve how fast you code, and some techniques for using that tool to really kind of drive your application development to the next level. So there's the recording, the QR code for the recording if you want to watch the replay. And actually, I'll be covering some of that today in the demo when I start doing some code. Okay. So check out last webinar. They're always up on Launchpad or developer.motorolasolutions.com. And if you go to the video section, you'll see a list of webinars that we've done in the past couple weeks. All right, so let's jump right into the topic for this week. Okay, so we're going to talk about using RhoMobile to develop for iOS, right? And before I actually do the walkthrough to show you what's involved from a process point of view and the different choices you have, I'm going to first spend some time talking about some of the design considerations that you want to have in your application in order to make it most suitable for the App Store, right? What are some of the things you can do to make sure that your app gets through the App Store from a design point of view, and kind of like what Apple's looking for, okay? So I'll give you some recommendations, not a complete list whatsoever, but just some things that you can do and some things that we have in our platform which would still allow you to write cross-platform applications, but with the same code, but also to to do some things to make it easier for App Store submission. Okay, and then I'll go through what is a iOS development and distribution process look like. And I'll spend most of my time covering how to do this using RhoHub, right? Particularly RhoHub using Windows. So like, don't install Xcode. How do you do all that stuff, right? So I'll be spending most of my time in that, and then at the end, if we have some time, I'll show you how to do it on a Mac, if you do have a Mac, with RhoStudio, and you kind of have two choices there for that. So we'll kind of cover the full gamut. Hopefully, it'll start off kind of easy, and then we'll get a little bit harder and harder as we go through it. All right, so the first thing I just want to point out, here's a QR code, here's the URL link for Apple's guidelines. There's a document that has like, umpteen number of things you need to comply to for that particular week. No, just kidding. So just check these guidelines. There's a lot of things in there. I just wanted to throw this out there because it may not be so easy to find, but look through that, and there's some things that I'm going to point out as we go through the presentation that really kind of apply to a roads application and what have you. But you need to be aware of these because, you know, at the end of the day, obviously they're the rulers of what goes into the App Store. And of course, if you do an enterprise distribution, that's a different, you know, different story. But anyway, just if you're thinking about putting on the App Store, you know, check these guidelines so you understand what Apple's looking for. Okay, and we're going to cover some of these things in the next couple slides. All right, so now I'm going to cover some of the things you can do in your application to make you know, your RhoMobile application, which, as you know, is kind of this web-based you know, platform, more native looking and feeling and behaving, right? So to do that, I'm going to actually flip over to my Mac and actually walk through some walk through a demonstration. So just give me a second here. So one of the things I wanted to cover is okay, sorry about that. Let me just switch my screens. Make sure you're seeing that. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here was actually using HTML5 input types. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, you know, by default in Apple, you know, we're using the native WebKit rendering engine. So whatever's in Safari browser on iOS, that's what we're using in our RhoMobile application to render the screens. And that WebKit already has built-in kind of you know, quasi-native functionality just by specifying the different input types, right? So instead of just input type equals text, you know, in your forms, you can actually change it to these different types, and you'll have this very native kind of feel for the keypad, or even in some cases the, you know, the roller decks or the spinner that's on the bottom, right? So let me kind of just show you that really quick in code and what that looks like. So I'm going to open up Sublime Text 2 just because it's super fast for kind of inserting snippets of code. I went over this last week. If you didn't see it, check out the webinar, and I'll cover this. I cover this in great detail. But just for the sake of this, you know, going through a lot of things, this is a fantastic tool to do that. So I have my project here, this native API demo, and I have just a simple web page. It's an HTML5 types, and I'm looking at it. You can see, and let me just make this bigger, I guess. Okay. So you can see here on the left-hand side we have password, input type number with a pattern. So if I just kind of kick that off and launch iOS simulator, and go to that page, we can see that the number changes the keypad to a number. The number plus pattern is even better because that's bigger numbers. And they have these variety of keypads. There's a slight difference here. This is text. It has the @ symbol. If you have a URL, these aren't so interesting, right? But if I go down to like time, right, you have a nice, right? So this is like instant native functionality that Apple loves to see in the applications instead of these plugins for jQuery even, or these other HTML-based plugins that don't look so native. So when you're using your forms and you have fields like this, you know, I would recommend that you use that because you know, it's just going to, you know, make your application look and behave more natively, right? All right. So the next thing we're going to cover is actually going through and adding some native APIs. So let me just jump back to the slide for a minute. So we have in our platform some native controls that not only work on iOS but also work on Android as well and some of the other platforms. So we kind of have 3 of them that I'm going to showcase here and give you a demonstration. One of them specific for iOS, the nav bar, but these other two, the toolbar and the native tab bar, are actually APIs that we have in Roads that allows you to expose a native control, right? So anytime where you're adding these type of native controls, again, it's going to make your application more acceptable to Apple when you're submitting it. Okay. So the difference here is the toolbar you've seen is kind of on by default. I'm going to show you how to modify that. The tab bar is typical tabs, and on Android it starts on the top, but you can place it on the bottom. iOS, it puts it on the bottom automatically. And then we have a native nav bar, which is that top nav bar, right? And I'll show you how that's different than what you get with jQuery mobile as well. Because as you know, jQuery mobile tries to make it look as native as possible, but in some cases it really doesn't behave the same as a native control. So if you can, and if it doesn't make your application too complex, I would opt to use some of these native APIs. All right, so let's first start off with a native toolbar example. So I'm going to jump back into Sublime Text, and I have also slides too if you want to look at it. We're going to go into the application.rb. Okay, and you've probably seen this. This is the default application.rb that gets created. There's a variable here at tabs. It's set to nil, and that's basically saying don't show the tab bar, right? We're going to actually show a toolbar, and I'm going to just start typing here. If you notice, I just typed TOOL and hit tab, and it inserted this nice snippet. This is a Sublime Text 2 feature that I talked about last week, and just for the purpose of doing this demonstration, it makes it a lot quicker. So let me launch that build again, and while it's launching, I will talk about this this API. There's two different ways you can use this API. The first, easiest method is just by declaring this variable. This variable, @toolbar, equals, and then you have options for putting things on the toolbar. So you can see here this default action back. It's using this icon. So there's different parameters you can have in this hash. Basically, this is a Ruby hash. Okay, so we have some default actions here to go to home, right? But then I added some custom actions. So here I'm going to go to that same HTML5 types model that I created before, and I'm going to use a different icon. See the coffee cup there. So if I click on that, it jumps to that page. Right. So here's just a nice way where you can add an instant toolbar, and you can have that available to your application. You can customize it that way. And again, this is very native. So you can see another option is if you don't want an icon, you can put a label, which obviously takes a lot of room. The icons are quite nice on the toolbar because you can fit quite a bit. You can almost fit probably 10 or so icons on the bottom, right? So the other thing that we can do is, and let me just exit out of there, we can add a tab bar, right? So again, I created this nice shortcut. So let me launch that build. And as you can see, I'm doing this all in Sublime Text 2. So again, if you missed the webinar last week, check it out. It actually builds quite quickly. So now here's the tab bar. This is a little bit different. I kind of like this native API. And again, it's just a simple setting tabs equal to this Ruby hash, and there's some different parameters here on there. Background color, the label. In this case, we're doing an icon and a label and some text, right? So you kind of get the idea. So there's different parameters in here. Again, you can specify, the different options, and it works very nicely, right? The nice thing is it stays on the screen, right? Like you'll notice, and I'll show you in the next example, this nav bar on a native iOS application, it doesn't move with the page, right? And that's because this is a jQuery plugin. So by using these native APIs, it really looks like a native application, much better than any web plugin that you can do. All right, so now let me Control-Z out of that one. Now we're going to do the nav bar example. Okay, so I'm going to go into my HTML5 index. Okay, and this is the index page for that HTML5 input types view that we showed before. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the controller for this, and I'm just going to show you how you can add a nav bar. If you didn't want to have that, kind of jQuery looking nav bar at the top, you can actually add a native nav bar, and this is the third API that we talked about. So again, I have my nice little Sublime Text 2 snippet that I've created, and in this case, well, let's just run it again, and you can see what's going on here. All right, so in this case, remember, I added this code to the HTML5 types model and the index view, so which was essentially this one. And you can see we created this nav bar on the top, and this one really kind of has 3 parameters, and this one's only available for iOS. So you can see that on the left-hand side, we are using, we set basically the title, right? So you have the title here specified, you have the left, and again, this is basically a Ruby hash, right? A left with some sub-properties, what the action is, what is the label, right? And in this case, when we specify back, it's actually using just the default back icon. And the right side, and where are we going to go with that? This one's actually jumping out to an options model, which I don't have defined in this application. But you can see that in this case, this navigation bar is, staying on top like a normal, I don't want to say normal, but a typical native iOS application. So in some cases, you might want to expose that. Now, you can also see that this creates a problem with the default application structure because we have this jQuery mobile, header, right? And not maybe some, since this is only available for iOS, we want to say, okay, well, we want to use the nav bar for an iOS application, and for everything else, we want to just use this jQuery header, right? So we kind of get the same looks, but we also take advantage of being very, very native on iOS where we can be, right? So I'm going to show you how to do that. And this gets into another nicety that we've talked about before in the past for RhoMobile application is, yes, we are delivering you a platform where you can develop cross-platform, but we know in some cases, like this one, you may want to, do something special or different for a particular platform. And that's what we call this per-platform configurations. And we have kind of two different ways to do that, right? So the first way that I'm going to show you is I'm going to go back into this HTML5 index view, and here's the header here. Here's the code for the jQuery header that's showing this bar, right? And basically what I want to do is I want to say, okay, if it's not iOS, then show this. Otherwise, if it is, it's going to, it's going to create this. And there's a couple different ways you can do it. But I just, for a point of example, if no iOS, not iOS, was my little snippet. That was a little snippet again that I created. And you can look at this. It's basically using the system.getProperty API, right? So system.getProperty, and there's many different properties, but the platform will tell you what platform you're running on. Okay, so we're basically going to say if it's not Apple, then show this this header. Okay, and that's essentially how it's going to work. So let's run that again. Now this time, what we should see is the header, the native header be displayed, and not the jQuery mobile one. So I'm going to click on Input Types, and you can see now we just have that native, the native top section here, the native nav bar, right, which is very nice and works more natively than the jQuery mobile one. So this is very powerful, this, the system get property, and that's why I created a snippet, because there's a lot of times in my code where I'm going to go in here and just say, okay, on Apple I'm going to do something different, right? Or on Android I'll do something different. And that's one way you can do it. But the other way you can do it is actually by changing the name of the files. If you have like too many if statements and you really just want to create a completely different view for iOS, you could, come in here and just, change this. Like in this case, we have these BlackBerry ones by default, index.bb. But if this was my my iPhone view, I would just change this to index.iphone.erb. Okay, and then this way, when the application runs, it's just going to load that view by default instead of loading the other view. Okay, and so you can do that. You can do that for Android. You can do it for iOS. You can do it for BlackBerry, of course. And that's just another way where you can come in there and just serve up different UIs, different functionality, depending on what your platform is, right? So, and you can see that we've, in the layout, if you open up the layout.erb, you can see that we already do this. So you can kind of get an idea of how that works. Here's one for Apple, and we're actually including, these frameworks. If it's not, we're not. And also down below, we include some iPhone-specific CSS. And so you can get an idea, and this is a very useful API. Okay. All right. So let's see, where are we now? So we covered these examples, and again, these are in the slides that I'll share when I post the recording. The nav bar, right? The per platform conditionals. Here is where I highlight the name of the file, right, if you want to serve up a completely different file. Let's talk about some other considerations. So far, we've talked about, using the HTML5 inputs, right? That kind of involves like no super duper coding. It's just making sure you don't use input text all the time. Change it to be the HTML5 types of inputs, right? We showed you how to use the native APIs that we offer in Rhodes, and we also showed you how to do some per-platform conditioning. Some other things that I just threw out there is other considerations, and again, these are things that kind of like, hey, make your application look as much as native as possible, and Apple will be happy and won't give you a hard time. That's what we're talking about, right? So one of the things that I mentioned here, and there's many different ways you can do this, is making sure you're taking advantage of gesturing and page transitions. Some of these things are on by default. This little code snippet is just a jQuery mobile snippet, which is essentially, binding to a swipe left event. And if you, use these things and put them in your code, again, it's just going to make it look more native, right? One other thing, and this one, I don't want to say gets a little tricky, but this has to do with, and I copied and pasted a snippet from the Apple guidelines that I showed before about app size, right? So in there it says apps larger than 50 megs, will, blah, 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 will automatically be rejected. So just be aware of this, making sure that your application complete as it ships, right, is not exceeding that. And then there's some other things that may come into play that you want to consider from a data storage point of view. The way Apple divides up the file system basically for the applications is that there's kind of two different places. There's the caches section and then the document section, right? The cache area is where we put things that could be easily created. So essentially your application, right? These things are not copied over to iCloud when the device backup occurs, right? The only thing that gets copied up into iCloud and takes over, the bandwidth of the cellular network is the items that are stored in the database. The documents folder in iOS. So we put the actual database in the documents folder for iOS by default. So this way, user data, your models, anything you synced, will be backed up, right? If for some reason you want to tweak those parameters and behaviors, there's things you can do in the build.yaml. And let me expand this because it's kind of hard to see. There's things you can do in the build.yaml to change this behavior. So if you wanted to put the database in the app root, then you can do that. If you want to, change some of these parameters, you can. You just need to be aware of what's happening. Maybe your database, can be recreated, and you don't necessarily need to have that backed up. And you're thoughtful of the user's bandwidth and all that good stuff. You may want to include it in there. So these are just some parameters you want to look at. Maybe you're also, in this case, where you're maybe creating files that are saving. If you do this row application get user path, this is actually pulling up where the documents are, right? So when you store that, when you do a file new, and you write, whatever, a binary file, then you want to make sure that gets backed up. Make sure you're putting it in the right path, right? And then there's some cases where you don't want things backed up at all, right? And there's this special iOS do not backup flag, and you can get to that without having to go into Xcode and all that stuff. You can specify that right in your model or in your controller. Let's say you don't want to have the product model backed up. You can specify that by setting set do not backup attribute. So I just pulled all of this from the documentation that we have online, and there's some more details on it. But I just wanted to mention it to you so you can see what's going on there. All right. All right. So let's get into. All right. So that was really kind of the things you should consider when designing and building your application. Now we're going to get into actually the development process. Okay, and for that, I'm going to switch back over to my Windows machine because I'm going to do some demonstration on Windows. Okay, so let's talk about some choices here for actually building for iOS. So one choice you have, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my time in this demonstration, is RhoHub, right? So if you want to build for iOS natively, right, you need a Mac, you need to set up Xcode, all that, blah, blah, blah. So as you know, with RhoHub, this builds platforms or builds applications in the cloud for all the platforms that we support, right? So essentially, from your Windows machine or Mac or Linux machine, whatever, you can log into RhoHub and set up your application and kick off a build in the cloud. And essentially, we have these build systems that are there for building the application. So in particular for iOS, let's say I'm a Windows guy and I don't have a Mac, I can use RhoHub completely to do that. I can even, part of the process, and I'll talk about this more in detail in a second, is about certificates and provision files. These are things that Apple requires from a developer point of view and also a deployment point of view to enable the applications to work on devices, right? So you can do this all from Windows, and what you essentially provide to RhoHub is you provide two things. You provide a certificate, all right, a developer certificate. You can provide the provision files, and these come right from the Apple Developer Portal. All right, I'm going to walk through this process. And then you tell RhoHub to kick off the build, and it gives you an IPA file, okay? An IPA file can then be copied to a real device, and you can test it on a device. So it's that easy, right? The other choice, and there's actually two kind of choices in the second scenario, is a local environment. So the local environment means, yes, you have a Mac, you have to fully set up the iOS development environment, including Xcode, etc. You generate your certificates through Xcode and using keychain access utility on the Mac. So you're kind of jumping across these different software. And again, the same sort of process on the Apple Developer Portal as you provide these certificates, blah, 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 and I'll walk through this. It spits out those provision files. And then you have a choice of either, creating an iOS app using a single command, a rake command for RhoStudio applications without having to go into Xcode, which is nice. And then kind of the next level up would be, let me just create an Xcode project, and I want to go into Xcode and actually do that. So we provide kind of three different ways to build for iOS. I'm going to focus on the easiest, what I think is the easiest, in using RhoHub. Before we get into the RhoHub demonstration, let me just spend a really quick minute talking about this process. And all of this great stuff is on Apple's website, developer.apple.com. Okay, Apple really, from a development point of view, there's two sides, right? There's development and testing, and then there's distribution, getting it out to the real users, right? On the development side, you're essentially, each developer on your team, creates this this certificate signing request, which is essentially defining who they are, right? They submit it on the Apple Developer Portal to the team lead, and then the team lead on the Apple Developer Portal approves that certificate and then hands back that developer a developer certificate, right? So now that's like one major piece that you need before any of this can work, right? And that's kind of done through Apple Developer Portal. Okay, then at the same time, that developer provides a UUID, which is a unique device for a unique device ID for your Apple device, also to the team lead. And that team lead, in all of this is kind of really done in the Apple Developer Portal, creates this device ID, matches it with the certificate, and then creates what's called a developer or development provisioning profile. Okay, this development provisioning profile needs to go onto the developer, device, the iPad, the developer iPad, and that provisioning profile is the key to everything. It essentially says, who can sign the application, what application identification is allowed, okay, and which devices this will run on, right? If you have a valid developer provisioning profile and that profile doesn't have that ID of that device, you're not going to be able to run the application. So this is like the biggest hurdle is just kind of getting through this process, and we'll show you how to do it using RhoHub a lot easier. The part that I'm really not going to spend too much time on is this distribution process. This material is very well covered on Apple's website. I'll just spend a minute talking about it because you need to understand the difference. The distribution side is, okay, now you've done all your testing, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to kick it out and get it ready for the App Store? You need to sign the application with distribution credentials, right? So instead of developer credentials, you're signing with distribution company credentials, right? So the team lead essentially goes into the Apple portal and requests a distribution certificate from Apple, right? Apple approves it, gives it back. That team lead could then create a profile, but this time it's a distribution profile, right? That includes the distribution certificate credentials, all within that profile, okay? And then when you're packaging your app up for distribution, you specify the distribution profile instead of the developer profile. So understand the delineation between distribution and development, and I think it'll make your life a lot easier. Okay, so here's a tool that I find very helpful in doing this from a developer point of view. Right? Remember I mentioned before. All right, so now I want to develop an iOS app. I want to put it on my iPad and test it out. I'm going to go and show you all that process of creating those certificates. But download this tool. This is from Apple, and it essentially allows you to get out of iTunes and copy IPA files, copy the provisioning files onto the device, and it really is something you're going to use from a developer point of view. So download that. It's available on the Mac and the Windows, and I'm actually going to show you how to do this in a moment. All right, so actually I'm going to show you how to do this now. So let's jump into, okay, so here's my iPhone configuration utility, and I have my wife's iPad connected to my machine with USB. So you can see no iTunes, nothing, right? I can look at the device information. One of the first things, as I mentioned before, is that UUID. So I'm going to click on the device, and I'm going to grab this ID number here, right, and send it to my team admin, right? And this way, he's going to go into the portal and create a device ID that represents that. Okay, so that's like step number one. Okay. So now I'm going to show you how to generate all of the certificates that you need to provide to RhoHub in order to build an iOS application. And normally on a Mac machine, this would all be done through Xcode, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do this all from Windows. So what I'm first going to do is
log in and I'll show you on the Apple developer portal as a developer what you would see. So let's go ahead and log in. Logging just into the Apple developer portal. Obviously you need to be in the developer program in order to see this. So I'm going to click on the provisioning portal. And the first thing I want to do is check my certificates. So you can see I don't have a valid certificate. So we need to go through that process in this portal in order to provide these credentials to RhoHub in order to build the application that's going to be used for development purposes. So you can see it's asking for a request for you to request a certificate. This is going to go to your team lead, and it gives you these instructions. Now, these instructions are for Mac and using Xcode. So we're going to kind of do the same thing and provide a file here, but do it a different way. And let me show you where those instructions actually are for Windows. So if I log into RhoHub, I'm logged into RhoHub here, and I'm looking at one of my applications. And if I select iOS, it's starting to prompt you for the certificate that I need and the provisioning profile, which we'll get to in a minute. But if you click on this little help button here, it will actually show you for Windows or Linux what you need to do. And you just need to follow these instructions step by step. Okay, and the first thing it'll do is it'll say install OpenSSL. If you don't have it, use git bash. Okay, and then follow the generating certificate signing requests instructions on iOS developer portal. So this is kind of that screen that I just showed you here. So we're going to jump to this next step. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open git bash. I have Git installed on my machine, so I'm just going to open that up. Let me just, so we can see these side by side here. I'm just going to follow these instructions. Okay, so I'm just going to type in open SSL, generate an RSA token, and I'm going to call it my key.key, and we're going to do 2048 bitwise, I guess. You see it generates, this is a private key file, okay? We're going to need this for the next step as well, so make sure you know where this is. So then the next thing it does is it tells me right here, type in OpenSSL, req, -u, -key, my key.key, -out, certificate, signing request, cert, signing request. And I'm just following these instructions here. Subject, and then email address equals my address. And then the common name, we'll call it Galvin, and the country equals the United States. Okay, so now what that should have done is actually create this file, certificate signing request.cert. All right, so let's just do a list star.cert. Oops. Okay, so you can see that I have this file there, and I'm going to use this file. And the next instruction here basically tells me what to do with that file. And effectively, I need to take this file that I just generated and upload it to the developer portal. Okay, so now let me jump back to the Apple developer portal, and this is where I need to basically provide that file. So I'm going to provide that file. I believe it's going to be in my users directory. Okay. And this is the file that I just created. Okay, so I'm going to select that file, and I'm just going to click Submit. Okay, so now I'm logged in as a developer here, and it's submitted to my team lead. So now I have to call my team lead up and tell him, hey, I just submitted. You should get an email. Okay, in this browser, I'm going to sign in as the team lead, which should have gotten that certificate request from that developer that we just did before. So let me go into the provisioning portal, and now remember I'm the team lead. I'm going to see a different view, and I can see that this team signing request came in from this developer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to approve. You'll want to approve that selected certificate. Okay, so now I'm going to come in here after I just approved that certificate. The developer still can't develop until I match that certificate and make sure there's a provisioning profile that exists that has that certificate as well as that device in there. So just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to create a new profile. Okay, and we're just going to call it webinar demos. Okay, and now I already have another user in here with the same name, which is unfortunate. So I'm just going to select Rob Galvin, and then just for the sake of showing this as an example, I'm going to select the devices that this divisioning profile has permission to run on. Okay, so I'm going to select all these devices that I own, and I'm going to click Submit. Actually, what I need to do here in the app ID is pick roads. So you need to select an app ID, and this is controlled in a different screen. So let me click Submit. Okay. So now I have a new provisioning profile. And if I just go back to the screen, it takes a moment for it to be active. You can now see that this provisioning profile is active. So let's take a look at that. So now you can see that this provisioning profile has an app ID. It allows these particular certificates to run, and that it also is allowed to run on these devices. So now from a team lead point of view, I'm pretty much set up so that the developer can write applications and use this particular provisioning profile. So now let's go back to the developer's view of all of this. So let me jump back to this browser. Okay, so now if I come back into the certificates, I can see that this certificate is now at a status of issued. Okay, so you need to get to this particular point within the developer portal in order for you to really proceed with, building an application on RhoHub. Now remember, if we were doing this on the Mac, these kind of steps would be different. It would be done through Xcode. You need to be jumping through a couple of different things as well. But effectively, just showed you how to create the certificate signing request on Windows, submit it to the Apple developer portal to team lead, and then have the team lead approve that and make sure that it's assigned to a provisioning profile. So recall, let's jump back to RhoHub. Okay. So if I logged into RhoHub, if you remember, it's asking for two things. So let's go back to those instructions and just recall where we're at. So we did all this. We generated the signing request. We uploaded the signing request to the developer portal. Okay, now the certificate has been generated. So now basically at step number 5 here. Okay, use the following commands to convert it to the P12 format. Okay, so let me go into here. I'm going to download this. I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to copy it to that same folder that we had the other certificate file in there. If we look at these instructions, what we're going to do is we're basically going to take the certificate that we downloaded, and we're going to output this new file, PEM, okay, developeridentity.pem. Then we're going to run the second command here, and this is where it needs that private key that you generated before in this step, and turn it into this developer_identity. Use this file as well, and then the output's going to be this iPhone_dev p12. So this is the file that we need to provide to RhoHub. Okay, that's the golden ticket there. Okay, so now here's the certificate that I just downloaded. Okay, remember there's this certificate signing request, there's the my key, and just to make it clear, let's copy these to a folder. I'm going to copy this here, and just because it renamed it kind of funny when it downloaded it, I'm going to copy that just so it's clear, we can see what's happening here. Okay, so now I have the three files basically that I need. Well, actually, I don't need this CER, this cert signing request anymore. Effectively, I'm just working with these two. So now let's go back and follow these instructions. So now open up my Git command. Now remember, I just copied those into my webinar folder that I just created. So I'm going to go into webinar, show you the files are there. All of those files are there. And I'm basically going to just follow these instructions. So now this is the CER file that I need. It's not called developer identity, so we're just going to replace that. So open SSL x509-in iOS development.cer form der. I'm going to output develop identity.pem, and the output format is pem. Okay, so this is effectively this right here, except I replaced developer identity with the CER file that I just downloaded from the portal. Hit return. We can now see that this developer identity was created. So now I'm just going to do the next command there. Open SSL, pkcs12, this is the encryption format, export, in key, my key, dot key. Here's the my key dot key, remember, is that private key that I created before in the first step. Okay, so make sure we do that. We're also going to take in, not developer identity, well actually it is developer identity. Sorry, so we're going to take in developer identity.pem. And this time we're going to output the iPhone dev.p12. All right, so I must have typed something wrong. So let's take a look. Open SSL. PK, okay. So I typed something wrong there. And let's just, this is driving me crazy. All right, so PKCS12, I had an extra C in there. Okay, this is where you would provide the password. Okay, so this is very important. This is what trips people up as well. Let me go back to RhoHub for a second. if you have a password on this particular PK file, you need to put that here. So just for simplicity, I'm going to not have a password. Okay? So what have I done? Go back to the help file. We've gone through all these instructions, and now we created the P12. And what does this say? It says select the P12 file to upload and enter the certificate password that we use. So this effectively gives you the steps, and you pretty much just have to do this once, as long as you make sure you save these certificate files and also remember what the password is. That's why I put a blank on the file. But anyway, once you do this, then you're able to provide this in RhoHub all the time. So I'm going to not select it just yet. I'm going to look at the help file on here, provisioning. We also need to provide the provisioning file. Okay, so in this case, we are providing the provisioning file that we got from the developer portal. So again, let me go in as a developer. I'm going to take a look at provisioning. And remember, we created this webinar as demo provisioning file. So I'm going to download this. We're going to save as this time. And we're going to go into a webinar, and we're going to save it in that same folder, all right, that we did before. So now we have this provisioning profile that we can provide to RhoHub. So now let me go back. Now I have all of the information that I need. Okay, now remember, this is the development set of provisioning profiles and certificates. If we were actually distributing and wanting to send this out to the App Store or Enterprise distribution, we would need to provide the distribution certificate and the distribution provisioning profile, which is different than the development one. The distribution profile and certificate is generated by your team lead. It's not tied to a particular device or developer. It basically is tied to your organization, and it allows you to distribute apps to any users. Okay, so that's a different process. I'm just showing you how to do the development. But at the end of the day, you still can build a distribution package in RhoHub as long as you provide the right credentials, okay, the right set of files. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to select this file. I'm going to go into the webinar folder that we created there. Now, I got all these files here. Which one do I create? Select. And remember, it says P12 one. So select the P12. Okay, it lists it there. I didn't generate a password at all. Okay, so I'm not going to type in a password, and I'm going to select provisioning, and I'm going to select the one I downloaded from the iOS developer portal. I'm going to select open. Now here's the bundle identifier area. What does that mean? Well, let's jump back to this, and let's take a look at the provisioning profile. Okay, you see we have a star right after this. I had to pick an app ID, but also there's this star here. If I look at the app IDs in the Apple Developer Portal, we can see that some of them actually create this com.blah blah blah, right? So this is what we would, if we were using this app ID in that provisioning profile, I would need to put in this. Okay, but right now the way this app ID is set up, okay, it doesn't need it. It's a wildcard. It's star. So I can put anything I want in there. Okay, so let's jump back to here, and I'm just going to put com.webinar.iOS demo. Okay, and then we're just going to click build. So you can see that it added the build, basically all this information here, who actually did this, because remember, you can have multiple people on your team under RhoHub, and now it's going out to, it kicked off the build to one of our build slave machines that has iOS set up, and it's actually generating the build in the cloud. Okay, so while it does that, let me just spend a couple minutes talking about what's happening in the cloud. So essentially, we have the SDKs and the iOS developer setup in the cloud, and it's using version 5.1. We tend to try to keep this current, but also, we may have gotten behind in a version or two. If you need to control the particular versions, and especially if there's a beta SDK coming out that you want to test your application with, you don't have control right now in RhoHub to select a particular iOS SDK. You would need to set up your local environment, and in that case you would need a Mac in order to target and build to particular iOS platforms. You can see that there's been other builds here, and you can keep these available. You can delete them, and then when it's complete, what's going to happen is you're going to be able to download the build, okay, which is a zip file, and I'll show you that in a minute. If the build has failed, right, you'll notice that, and if you click on this icon, you can see that effectively shows you the build log. And I'm going to jump down all the way to the bottom and show you that usually it's a code signing error, and it says identity iPhone developer doesn't match. And normally, in this case, what I did was I didn't upload the I didn't generate the correct P12 file, okay, that matched the particular provisioning profile. Okay, so remember, all of that needs to match. All of those needs to line up. And the key is taking a look at in your developer, really just taking a look at the provisioning profile and making sure that you have all of these three major ingredients. This is what you need. This provisioning profile needs to go on the device. Okay, so while that is still building, I'm going to set up my device with that provisioning profile because I need that first, and then I'll also need the IPA that this is going to generate. So, as I mentioned before, I downloaded this iPhone configuration utility, which is a good utility for doing things. So, I've downloaded this iPhone configuration utility, and I'm going to put the provisioning profile on there. So, if you take a look at the device, I have an iPad connected to my machine, but I'm going to take a look at my library. So, this is what's locally on the machine. Okay, and I don't have any applications yet. I don't have any provisioning profiles. So I want to add a provisioning profile. Okay, it's going to be the same one that we downloaded from the iOS developer portal. Okay, so where do we put this? We put this in webinar. So we're going to open this up. So now I have that available in my library. And it also installed it to that particular device. Well, it didn't. It's listed there, but you need to install it. So click on the button, and now any application that is using this profile will be able to run on this particular device. So you need to have the provisioning profile installed on the device. All right, so if I look back at the build status, you can see that it actually failed. And I was kind of wondering why it failed because I did follow the instructions. But one thing I did miss, that you guys might have caught, is that it actually, when I was generating this P12 file, it says this is a new password for the file and cannot be blank. It was actually in bold, and I totally missed that. So I am just going to create that file again and not make it blank this time. All right, so this time I'm actually going to make a password. Okay, so now I made the password on that file. That file was created, and now let's do the build again. So now I'm going to select the file. This is the new one that I just created. I can open that, and now I'm actually going to put in that same password I just created. I'm going to go to the provisioning profile. I'm going to select the provisioning profile file. I'm going to click open. And remember, the bundle identifier doesn't matter, so we'll just say con.test webinar.test, and we'll kick off another build. Okay, so before, the build actually took maybe 5 to 10 minutes, so it actually happens pretty quickly. As I mentioned before, if we looked at the iPhone configuration utility, we're all set up with having the provision file there. So let's just wait for the build to come up. Okay, so it looks like the build is complete now, and it succeeded. So now we're going to download it. Wait till it's downloaded, and we'll just copy this into our webinar directory that we created before. We'll extract this. And now we have the files that we need. Basically, the IPA is the one that we need the most. So let's go into the iPhone configuration utility. And we're going to click Add. We're going to go into that folder, and you can see it's blank right now because it's selected device info. Let's change that to IPA, and now we see the application. We'll click Open. So now this is going to install it to our library, as well as copy the files and make them ready for the device. Occasionally it'll blank like that, but let's click on the device, and now we can see that it's installed. There's the ID that we selected during the RhoHub build, filling out the form, and we need to click Install. And then that takes, a couple of seconds for the application to install on the device. And while it's doing that, let's open another utility so you can see my screen. Is iTools, and this lets you see the live view of the iPad desktop. So there it is. There's the application, and let's click on it. You can see that it launches, and then you can also see that there's the application that we created before in the demonstration with the tabs. And that's effectively how you build an iOS application using RhoHub. Notice we haven't touched a Mac whatsoever. Essentially what we did was we followed the instructions that you find in RhoHub. In this section here, just to kind of recap, we basically just did all of this, okay? And that resulted in providing the certificate, providing the developer provisioning file, specifying the bundle, clicking Build, downloading the IPA, and installing it on the device.
And this is all in the slide. So this goes through the information again. Again, you generate the CSR. You submit that CSR. You create that self-signing certificate request. Submit it to your team lead. Okay. This is all done through the Apple, provisioning portal. Your team lead approves it and gives you your developer certificate. That's step number 1. All right. Then you effectively take that and turn it into a P12. Now you're doing this only because you want to use it with RhoHub, and that's what RhoHub needs. It needs both the private and public key in there, so this way it could install it on the slaves that we have generating the builds. Okay. The team lead also creates the device in the system, creates this provisioning profile. Okay, so that's key number 2 is to make sure you have the right provisioning profile tied to all your devices and certificates. You download this provisioning profile and you effectively provide it to RhoHub and kick off the build. Okay, the build is complete. Then you'll be able to download the file, the IPA, and use the tool to put it on the device. If it fails, check the click on the little icon, and you'll see that in most cases it's something with you didn't give the right certificate, right? You selected a certificate file that might have been a P12 file, but you didn't create it right, and that's usually what's the problem. The provisioning profile is usually fine because that's that's put together from the developer portal, but it's the certificate file that is usually the issue there. Okay. And then this is where we actually set up the device. The 2 things you need to provide on the device is the provisioning profile and then download the IPA file to the device, and the application will be on there. Okay, in this case I was using an iPad. All right, so there's 2 other ways to do this, and I'm just going to blow through this really quick because we're running out of time. But so what we just showed you before was using RhoHub on Windows. I didn't have to go into a Mac at all. I didn't have to do anything on a Mac or set up a Mac. I pretty much did it all right from Windows. Created the certificates, uploaded the certificates to Apple website, downloaded the profile, downloaded the developer certificate, put those things on the device, generated the IPA from RhoHub, and all's good. So that's like option number 1. Option number 2 is that local environment, and this is where I would pick RhoStudio, and I would have to set up my Mac. I would have to set up Xcode. Once I have my project in RhoStudio defined, I can just go to that project folder and type in a single command: rake device iPhone production, right? And before you would do that, you would make sure that you specify the SDK. Before you probably were using the iPhone simulator, like I showed before, but for developing for the device, you want to make sure the SDK is not the simulator; it's using iPhone OS. So you would do that, change the build.yaml, kick off this command line right in your project folder, and on the Mac, you set up all of those certificates through Xcode, and it's in keychain access, and by default, it's going to try to find an iPhone developer. Developer certificate, okay? And if it does, it's going to ask you if you want to use that, right? So you should see this prompt come up, and you would say allow, and then it would effectively create a folder inside of your project under bin, under target, and it would create a folder with those same files that essentially RhoHub produced, right? So this is all done locally. If you want, if you have a Mac and you're used to developing on a Mac, this is, I guess, quicker, if you will, than waiting for the build to come from RhoHub. In some cases, the RhoHub actually creates the build pretty quick, so I don't really notice too much of a difference. But you may want to just run this locally if you want to choose this option, and you have greater control over the SDK in this case. I failed to mention before, using RhoHub, one of the caveats is we have the SDK installed on the RhoHub servers, and it's at 5.1 right now. If for some reason you want to use a beta SDK or a new one that just came out that we haven't installed yet, then this is an option that you would have to choose. You would have to run it locally using RhoStudio, and you would pick the SDK that way. Okay, so that's choice number 2 in developing for iOS. The third choice, which is a little bit more complex, is where if you have a Mac, again, you need to have a Mac, you need to have Xcode on this choice, where you would actually want to create an Xcode project and do everything inside of Xcode. So we offer these 2 commands that essentially set up your project, your Xcode project, and this Xcode project is going to be found in the platform folder, not the project folder. Okay, and you'll see the Xcode project there. You would open it, and then essentially you can do everything inside of Xcode. This is a little bit more complex. You need to go into Xcode. You kind of need to learn Xcode, etc. But if you want to have even further control of how it looks and behaves on iOS and add even more things, then this could be an option for you. Okay, so those are kind of the three choices for building for iOS. We focus mostly on RhoHub. One other thing that I want to quickly mention is that RhoElements license, right? So this question comes up, as I mentioned before, and this isn't a licensing webinar. We're going to do that another time. But really quick, when you're developing for iOS, products, it uses the native WebKit. It doesn't use the Motorola WebKit. It uses the native iOS WebKit for both a Rhodes or a RhoElements application type. Okay. If you want to use certain APIs like barcode, NFC, database encryption, inline signature capture, those do require a RhoElements license since 3.3.3 version of Rhodes, and in that case, you would need to provide the deployment license information in your build.yaml, and then this way it's going to package up the application with the license. Okay, and again, that's only if you want to use these APIs that are RhoElements add-ons to iOS. Okay, otherwise you have other APIs available to you. All right, so that essentially goes through the demonstration, and I'm going to cover a quick resource of the week really quick because we're running out of time, and that is, you saw that I used some different icons. This is a great set of icons. There's a free set to use, but there's also a nice set of 400 for a relatively cheap price of $25. Glyphish, which is really nice in that you can use those icons in the tab bar, and I forget the guy's name who developed it, but he also puts together, when you purchase the larger version, a version that's Retina ready. So a really nice handy website for those icons that are pretty trendy now in terms of tab bars and toolbars that you want to put on there. So there's the Glyphish icons. Okay, so we're pretty much almost at the end of the session here. I'm going to jump into questions, but before we do that, I am going to ask you a question, mostly because I want to see if you're still awake. But anyway, so while we're getting to some of the questions, essentially want to find out, how you plan on developing for iOS. I presented a couple of different options. One of the options was, using RhoHub straight from Windows, no Xcode, no Mac. Using RhoHub but from a Mac, and then you also have I'm going to use, I'm going to use a Mac. I'm going to use Xcode. I'm going to run that command line, and then also the more advanced version of, hey, I want an Xcode project. Let me do everything in Xcode. Right. So just kind of want to get a feel for that. And let me open up the floor to questions. I saw a bunch come in. All right. So let me get to some of these questions. First question came from Victor. How can we have a customized toolbar, navigation bar, let's say a sliding tabs, etc.? Well, so when we use those native tab bar or native toolbar APIs, that's essentially the default APIs for the native, whatever is native, so the Android, iOS. If you want to have more advanced features, you could write a native extension, right? And we didn't really cover that topic. I know people have been asking for it. We'll do a repeat of that. But that's one way you can do it. You may even be able to create that Xcode project and then manipulate it that way. That's a little bit more complex. So there's definitely options. And of course, as new things come out, we're going to be adding, certain aspects. But if we don't provide something, you can always write a native extension to whatever native API, and then kind of use those, per platform conditional statements that we talked about before in exercising those. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. Okay. Is there any way to make native calls? Objective-C. Yeah, this came from Emerson. Yeah, so this, as I mentioned before, anything you want to do natively, you can always write a native extension for. I didn't get into that in this session. We have a kind of an old webinar on that. We're going to redo that one as well. But then there's some documentation on it as well. Essentially what it does is it provides a sample stub project on how to write native extensions and do native calls right from your Rhodes application. So that's kind of how you do that. All right, so let me just show you guys the results of the poll. All right, I just any last minute questions? Okay. All right. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for attending today's session. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties we had, but hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you not next week, but the week after, and we'll see you next time. So thanks again, everybody.